All right. Good afternoon. Happy Wednesday afternoon to you all. Thank you to those of you who are here with us present in the Zoom meeting. Um, and hello to all of you who are watching this on the archive recording. We are going to continue our discussion of microsociology, and in particular, today we'll be talking about Erving Goffman and his text, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, which we've said in previous classes is basically built on a metaphor that social life is like a theater or a drama in which people are acting and playing roles to create an impression for their audience. Pardon me, today I'm having a bad allergy day. So bear with me, I'm a little under the weather. I would like to start by synthesizing some major points about what we've said so far to this point about microsociology. Point number one is that microsociology is to be contrasted with the dominance of so-called macro sociology in sociological theory and in sociological research. Macro sociology, as the name suggests, is the kind of sociology that starts with the big picture of society and its institutions, economics, politics, government, the healthcare system, the educational system. Uh, just macro sociology sort of starts with the big picture, whether it's from sort of a more radical perspective like Karl Marx or a more conservative perspective like Emil Durkheim. The things that these have in common is that they start with society and history is basically their starting point for their analysis. Microsociology emerged in the 20th century as a kind of an alternative to that macro sociology in the sense that it focused on the minutia of everyday life, people's, in particular, their interactions with one another, the way that people, carry on conversations, the way that people dress to impress, the way that they, in one way or another, perform a kind of role in social life, and the way that they use symbols and language in order to do that. So, microsociology, in that sense, its starting point is the everyday interactions between people. And so rather than treating society as a thing, as an object, microsociology is different in that it treats society as a kind of a process, as a thing that people are in the process of creating and making through their interactions. So macro sociology kind of treats society as like a finished product, as a thing, whereas micro sociology looks at it as something that is always in the process of being made and therefore in the process of changing. So that's one very kind of salient difference. The second key point is that this means that microsociology has a kind of a different method for the studying social life. It is a different kind of method for doing research. So microsociology is because it's concerned with the everyday occurrences of interaction between people. Microsociology employs a different kind of a method that sometimes we call like participant observation or ethnography, or what I like to call just like kind of scientific people watching. We look at the interactions between people on a day to day sort of basis. We kind of study people in their naturalistic settings, as they carry on their lives. And an important part of this is that we have to kind of understand, as sociologists, we have to understand the world through the eyes of the people that we study, rather than, imposing our own judgments or, even like trying to be like scientifically objective. The important point for microsociology is to really like put yourself in the shoes of the people that you're studying, to see things from their perspective, to have a certain kind of empathy, in which we can sort of arrive at an understanding of how the world looks through the perspective of these people that we're studying. Um, and so that is different than, say, the dominant method of research, which is more about a kind of an objective detachment, or one in which people kind of the scientists impose their own interpretations or their own judgments onto the people that we are studying. A microsociology approach kind of presupposes more empathy, in which we are trying to see things from the point of view of the people that we are studying. And, that's not always a kind of an easy thing. We have to kind of be aware of our own, as sociologists, our own like judgments, our own prejudices, our own, you know, sort of biases in the way that we look at the world. And we have to sort of be aware of that. The third point that we have kind of just been discussing is that there are these different types of microsociology. There is what we will call symbolic interactionism. We'll be looking at symbolic interactionism in more depth on Monday's class, when we talk about the work of Herbert Bloomer, who was a really important figure in the study of symbolic interactionism. Herbert Bloomer was kind of the one that gave symbolic interactionism like its name. He kind of named it as a field of study. There are also these fields called ethnomethodology and phenomenology, basically, fields of study that are kind of derived from philosophy, in which they look at, the way that people construct meaning and, kind of understand their perspective in time and space. And so phenomenology, for example, is a long-standing philosophical tradition that then has been applied to the study of social life. And then the third type of microsociology is what we'll be getting into today, which is the approach of Erving Goffman, who is kind of like a category unto himself. Erving Goffman's research was very kind of idiosyncratic, very kind of like one of a kind. He combined a lot of different influences, say from Emile Durkheim, in the way that he looked at ritual and the creation of meaning. And as we've been discussing, he combined that with a kind of a dramaturgical point of view, in which he looks at society as a kind of theater, in which people are performing and playing roles. I'd like to go to the screen share here and pull up just a little bit about Erving Goffman, his career as a sociologist. And then also, I have a short film for us that will hopefully kind of introduce us to some of these ideas from Goffman, and especially about the idea of the presentation of self in everyday life. So with this situation here, okay, trying to make myself look less creepy in the light. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna go to the screen share here, and let's just take a look just quickly about Durkheim's life and his works and his concerns. Um, he was born in and raised in Canada, and then came to America roughly, I think, in the 1950s in order to study sociology. As we see here, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life was his first major book. It was published in 1956. After publishing that book, Erving Goffman went on and worked in the National Institute of Health. I believe that that is discussed down here. Yes. He worked as an assistant to the athletic director of the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And here he basically did research on, what were then called like asylums, or basically like mental health institutions. In the 1950s, he was doing this sort of work, studying people who, were in one way or another like mental patients. And so his next major book was this book called Asylums, in which he kind of did this observational work of mental patients and inmates in mental health institutions. And again, where he did this kind of form of inquiry where instead of like imposing his own judgments and perspectives, he was trying to understand the dynamics of asylums from the perspective of the people who were the patients, and who were living in those situations, and also to understand the interactions between the patients and the doctors. And so he engaged in this kind of like what we call participant observation, in which he is, kind of immersed in the everyday life of this institution, and, for a long period of time, and in which he sought out to describe the dynamics of the mental health institution. If any of you've seen or read the novel called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was later made into a movie starring Jack Nicholson, that's a little bit of kind of like what Goffman was kind of onto, was trying to understand the dynamics of this institution and the way that like mental health was, defined, the way that insanity was defined, the way in which like patients understood their own circumstances. These were all things that Goffman sought to grapple with. Um, the rest of the Wikipedia page here kind of describes like his influence and his legacy. As you see here, I think the first sentence is that he was considered by some to be the most influential American sociologist of the 20th century. So this is someone whose perspective really had a wide-ranging influence for many decades. Um, some of his kind of later works are really interesting too. He wrote this book called Stigma, which is, basically about like how, stigma is kind of like a negative judgment or perception that people have of certain categories of people in society. And so, how people then kind of like internalize a sense of shame, when they've been like stigmatized. So people with a criminal record, or people who have various kind of like disabilities and things. Goffman sought to understand the dynamics of social stigma, and what he called the management of spoiled identity, how people manage their social lives in the context of where they've been kind of stigmatized for one reason or another. And then, like some of his later books, he wrote this book about like frame analysis. The one I find most interesting is he wrote a book about gender advertisements, like the way that gender is represented in like he mostly looked at like magazine and television advertisements. This was in like the early 1970s, so it was around the time of like when the women's movement was getting a lot of influence and calling attention to different forms of like gender inequality. And so Goffman started looking at like magazine ads and TV ads in terms of like how they portray men and women. And his kind of like conclusion was basically like women are generally positioned in a more kind of like passive kind of way, as being represented as in one way or another dependent on men, almost in this kind of like in a, almost like childlike kind of dependency. Remember this was back in the 1970s, and um, things have changed to some extent, and probably things were more extreme at that time. But it's again a really interesting analysis in which Durkheim is or Goffman is looking at sort of the minutia of everyday life, the things that like you and I might otherwise, take for granted or look past or just like not even notice. Goffman had a real talent for bringing things to light that most of us would otherwise overlook. And he kind of would bring these things to light and shine a light on them and say like, oh, isn't this interesting, or isn't this weird, or isn't this like kind of messed up, and he had a real knack for doing that as a sociologist, and that's in part why he's ended up being such an influential figure. If this works, and I hope it will, I would like to show you just a short film about the presentation of self in everyday life about this book. It hits on a lot of the themes using, like clips from films and things like that, that show, what is in his first book, what he calls like a dramaturgical perspective, like this idea that society is, a theater in which all the world's a stage, and we're all, kind of like performing on a front stage with the expectations of our audience in mind. It hits on a lot of key themes. And so I'd like to show this, and then perhaps we can do a whiteboard or discussion with those of you who are here in the class today, and then like sort of hop into the readings. If this does not work, like if you can't hear it or see it, please do immediately chime in and let me know that something is wrong. I've never actually shown a video through Zoom before. I probably won't do it very often, but in this case, I think this is pretty well done, and it's short. It's only like 12, 13 minutes. Okay. So holler at me if you can't see or hear.
A date proposal should be specific, not one of those "you busy Saturday" things. That's a part of date etiquette, and a girl likes it. A girl likes a fair chance to decide whether she wants to date or not. Oh. Yeah, no. I'd like to go. It's up to Danny to give Alice all the details of the date, but if he leaves anything out, he can always ask. It ought to be good. I think we'll enjoy it. Let's see. I'll pick you up a weekly Saturday about 7:30. How's that?
Erving Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life is a foundational sociological text that uses the metaphor of theatre to explain how individuals manage their identities in social interaction. Goffman argued that everyday life involves a series of performances in which people present themselves in ways that will be accepted and understood by others. Through their performances, individuals work to establish and maintain a particular definition of the situation that benefits them and aligns with their goals. These performances are not necessarily about deceit or manipulation, but about fitting in social life by managing impressions and guiding how others interpret the interaction. Central to Goffman's work is the idea of performance. Performance is any activity by an individual that aims to influence how others perceive them. Performances are guided by social norms and expectations. They signal to others what they can expect of us in a given situation and what we can expect of them. Through our performances, individuals are able to construct and maintain a shared definition of the situation.
If anything ever should come up about one of us, let's ask right out. Get the facts. No jumping to conclusions. Okay, but I've never jumped to conclusions about you. After all, you're my best friend, I know. But sometimes people like Frida Thompson can cause an awful lot of trouble between two good friends like us.
To explain how these performances operate, Goffman introduces the distinction between the front stage and the backstage. Front stage, where the individual performs their role in front of others. Behaviour in the front stage is often scripted and formal because it is meant for public viewing. For instance, a teacher delivering a lesson in a classroom behaves in a deliberate and structured way to maintain authority and professionalism. In contrast, the backstage, where individuals can step out of their role and behave in ways that might be inappropriate or too personal for the front stage. In the staff room, that same teacher might complain about students, act informally, or even express doubt about their own abilities. This backstage is crucial because it provides the individual with the space to relax and prepare for their next performance. Goffman also breaks down the components of the front region into three key elements: setting, appearance, and manner. Setting refers to the physical environment and props that support performance. For example, a judge's courtroom includes a raised bench, a gavel, and formal robes, all of which help to establish an atmosphere of authority and seriousness. Appearance includes all the visible features of the individual that signal their social status or role, such as clothing, grooming, and posture. Police officers' uniform, for instance, communicates authority before they even speak. Manner refers to the individual's style of interaction, how they behave in the moment. Consider how a therapist's calm and attentive demeanour reassures the client that they are being heard and taken seriously.
The importance of first impression. They exert a tremendous influence on our lives. First impressions are lasting and difficult to overcome. This emphasizes the importance of our first meeting with new employees. For new employers are naturally under high nervous tension, which makes them keenly sensitive to impressions, favorable or unfavorable. This sensitiveness gives us an ideal opportunity for creating favorable and lasting impressions.
Another important idea in Goffman's framework is impression management, a process by which individuals attempt to control the image they project to others. People constantly work to shape how they are seen, using both verbal and non-verbal cues. For example, in a job interview, a candidate might dress smartly, arrive early, and speak confidently, all actions designed to give the impression of competence and reliability. Impression management is not limited to the formal settings. Even in casual conversations, people monitor how they are being perceived and adjust their behavior accordingly. Thematic realization refers to the way individuals actively highlight certain aspects of their identity during a performance, especially when those aspects might otherwise go unnoticed. It is not enough simply to be competent or responsible. The individual must also demonstrate these traits to the audience in a clear and convincing way. And so, a doctor may pause to explain the diagnosis in simple language, showing not just their medical knowledge, but also their care and attention. In this way, qualities such as expertise, concern, and authority are not just possessed, but must be made visible to others. The performance becomes a way of drawing attention to what is socially significant about the self in that moment.
We can't hear it anymore.
But sometimes performances fail. This is where the concept of embarrassment becomes important. Embarrassment occurs when something disrupts the expected definition of the situation. It signals a break between the intended performance and what the audience actually sees. For example, if a speaker forgets their words during a formal presentation, or if a student accidentally contradicts a teacher in front of the class, both the performer and the audience experience discomfort. In these moments, individuals often act quickly to repair the situation. They may laugh it off, apologize, or shift the topic to restore order and save face. Embarrassment reminds us how fragile our performances can be and how much effort goes into maintaining them.
Laura, what's wrong?
Social life is not only about individual performances, but also about group cooperation.
Why don't we go and take a look at the towels that are coming out of the Westinghouse laundromat? Now, you ladies have all seen with your very own eyes just how much sand each of these center post agitator machines lift.
Performances are often carried out by teams of individuals who collaborate and maintain a shared definition of the situation. Family hosting guests might work together to create the impression of harmony and hospitality, even if there were arguments earlier in the day. And hospitality staff in a restaurant work together to ensure a pleasant experience for their customers. Each member knows their part in the performance, helps others stay in character. Underlying all of this is Goffman's view of the self as something that is not fixed or internal, but is instead constructed through social interaction. Self does not exist prior to performance. It emerges from it. We become who we are by enacting roles and responding to how others react to us. This view challenges the idea of an inner, unchanging personality. Instead, Goffman suggests that the self is a social product, built up and sustained through a series of public displays. For example, someone might come to see themselves as a leader, not because of an inequality, but because they successfully perform leadership in different situations and others treat them accordingly. The self, in Goffman's analysis, is the outcome of ongoing social processes, not the starting point. Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life provides a powerful way to understand how people navigate social life. By treating everyday interactions as performances, Goffman reveals the careful work individuals do to manage impressions, maintain roles, and fit into different settings. His theatrical metaphor helps us to see the complexity behind even the most ordinary social encounters and reminds us that social reality is something people actively construct through interaction.
Okay.
The blame. Oh, no.
Okay. Um, so this book was written 70 years ago. Okay, 70 years exactly to the date, 1956. And I was thinking about like what has changed since 1956 to 2026 that I think makes the performance of self, the presentation of self, even more important in our times than it was in Goffman's time. The two major changes I'm thinking of are, first of all, with regard to work. So in Goffman's time, more people were involved in like manufacturing work, so that if you were, working on an assembly line or in an auto factory or a steel mill, whereas today, more people are involved in service work. And I think that the performance of self matters a lot more in service work than it does in manufacturing. Not that it doesn't matter in manufacturing, but kind of like in manufacturing, like if you show up looking like a slob at the assembly line, probably nobody really cares that much. But if you're like in customer service or, in one way or another, sort of an outward facing job, as they call it, where you're, dealing with the public, um, your performance is like part of your job. What you're doing is producing like an image. You're producing a role, an act. And the thing I find so sometimes amazing and artistic about service people, the thing I don't know that I could do myself, is the way that people maintain that performance, even if necessarily like you're like in a bad mood or a customer is irritating you or your boss is irritating you. The way that people are able to keep face is the way that Goffman talked about it, like to like to maintain face in spite of whatever you may be going through internally. Um, that is a really important part of service jobs and service work and customer service that I think is way more important in our time than it was in Goffman's time. Certainly in Goffman's time, there were still like salespeople and there were people that engaged in this service work. But as a percentage of our economy, one of the big economic changes that has happened in the last 70 years has been the rise of this kind of service work and the sort of decline of like manufacturing, the decline of like, assembly line work and stuff like that. People are much more likely now to be engaged in these kind of outward facing customer, facing kinds of jobs. And I know a number of you already do that kind of work. I think Jill and Skeeter, I think we're talking about this on the perusal. If you want to, chime in with examples um, from that here, that's fine. And if not, that's also fine. But I found that to be a pretty interesting conversation. And you all, we're also talking about like, in say like a job interview, how important this kind of performance of the self is, all the way down to like the props that you use to make a convincing performance, how you dress, how you do your makeup, how you do your hair, the way that you speak, the eye contact that you make with the person interviewing you, the way that you shake their hand, all these like subtle little cues that it's almost like we all have to be kind of like expert actors, like we're all in some way or another kind of like acting our way through this world. The other thing that's changed significantly since the 1950s, of course, is the rise of like social media, and here like again like the performance is paramount. This Goffman talks about this distinction between the front stage and the backstage, where in the front stage we're, knowingly performing for an audience, and then in the backstage we can kind of like let our hair down and be ourselves or whatever. And in online social media, it's all front stage. Like it's just all like surface level kind of performance, especially if you think about something like, like online dating, for example, the way that people like curate their profile and the way that they come off to other people to try to make an impression. And then when you're like online dating, you almost like have to like, you have to like sleuth for, signs of what's, in the backstage, like we all know we can see in the front stage the impression that the person's trying to make. And then we have to like do some kind of like detective work to like, infer like what's in the backstage. What are we not seeing, that the person wants to keep like behind the proverbial curtain, right? So in a lot of ways, I feel like the world that we live in now is a much more kind of like front stage kind of world. I think about this with regard to like celebrities too, like the way that celebrities are always, front staging themselves, even when like they are pretending to give us a glimpse into their backstage, even when like on their Instagram account or whatever, like a celebrity is like, oh, here's me just relaxing with my dog and my family and, just, living life, making breakfast and all this kind of thing. But that in itself is also a very curated front stage kind of thing. Like that is like people are trying to make an impression of their backstage that's actually a front stage. Go ahead, Kai.
Yeah, I think in terms of like social media, I or not social media, but like with celebrities, I think it's actually interesting because I think Like when I think about like the 90s and early 2000s, I think there was more like mystique regarding like celebrities, like more allure. Like
Yeah.
there wasn't social media, so like everything that they presented to us was based off of like magazines or what like whatever image they decided to put out. But I think now I actually think it's kind of not the opposite, but I think because everyone has a smartphone now, everyone can just record like interactions maybe they don't want to put out,
Yeah.
and so I think it may be the opposite with maybe not the opposite, but I think it's like I don't know. I think social media actually works against celebrities now, than how before they can control the image, but that's really no longer the case. And I also feel like even though like as far as social media is concerned, not like online dating, but just like a lot of other things like TikTok, for example. Like I think that there is, there definitely is the front and the back, or in the backstage, but I do feel like there's like a growing number of people, or there's like this growing trend that people are now wanting more of the real than like this like facade. Like there's like this girl who, no makeup on, just look very regular, and she did like this Dr. Pepper like jingle, like, just put it out, just very regular, and she got like a $2 million, I think she got $2 million off of that, just
Wow.
very basic, so I think that there's like a growing number of people that kind of want more authenticity versus like, the presentation, I guess.
Yeah, I definitely agree, especially with that last point, Kai, that like authenticity is a thing that people come to crave in a world where everything seems so like contrived and performative that people really long for some kind of expression of authenticity. The ironic thing is that authenticity might itself be kind of contrived, like it might be like made to look authentic rather than actually being authentic. And but there are, to your earlier point too, about like with these cell phone videos and stuff that can capture, like these awkward moments or these moments, that people didn't intend, to have made public, like, they're like yelling at their assistant or something like that. There is more potential for that sort of thing because of like the technology. The celebrities can't always control the front stage, maybe in the ways that they used to, because they might get seen on somebody's cell phone video. Go ahead, Jill.
Yeah, can you hear me right now?
Yeah, I can.
I was gonna say that it's like we have too much access to celebrity, and it's actually like working against them.
Yeah.
The instantaneous access, and people will get dragged on the internet for it, and sometimes it's right. So
I like this thing too that Goffman calls. He talks about embarrassment, right? Like, so just because like we're all expected to perform in some way doesn't mean that it always goes right. Like sometimes people, screw up their performances in some way or another, or they don't perform according to expectations. And so then there's this moment of embarrassment. And he talks about the way that like other people in those situations kind of like come to the rescue of the embarrassed person. Do you guys ever have this? Like, you're hanging out with your friends, or you're hanging out with your family or something, and somebody does like something embarrassing, or somebody says something kind of embarrassing, and then other people kind of like work to alleviate the situation in some kind of way. Goffman called it cooling out the mark, because he was talking about like he studied for a while like people who ran like con games like on the street, like card tricks and stuff like that, where people would get conned out of their money. And when they realized they had been conned out of their money, people would get like embarrassed and often angry. And so there was another guy whose job was to basically cool him out, to chill him out from like getting, feeling too much like he had been publicly humiliated in this way. Because public humiliation, is one of the great fears of people, to be embarrassed or shamed in a public manner, really gets to some core, primal fears that people have. And so there's a certain amount of like kind of social work that goes into alleviating that situation when the performance goes wrong and people get embarrassed. Yeah, go ahead, Jill.
This goes back to the being a server restaurant manager person.
Yeah.
Um, when we would have like a particular guest that was a little more high maintenance than others, if they were unhappy with their server, when I was in the management position, I would essentially, had a handful of servers that I would say, "Hey, I need you to take over this table." And this is the person that's upset. And I could count on those particular people to cater to that individual person better and kind of turn it around. They were like, I had a handful of people that would put on a performance for that specific person. And
Yeah, so they were people that really were skilled at doing that, like of dealing with difficult people.
yeah, generally when you have, the Karen phrase comes from the restaurant business. So when you have a Karen,
Uh-huh.
um, the more attention you give those individuals that are like that, the happier they'll be. And so
Like the
people that were just,
speak, like I want to speak to the manager kind of person.
yes, yes,
Yeah. Uh,
100%.
yeah, the Karen.
I had shifts where I would, bartend for a few hours and then I would be the closing manager for a few hours. And the only difference is me taking off my bartending apron and putting on like a colorful cardigan, and people would just treat me entirely different.
Yeah. The
The props that you have are just a change of a single piece of clothing, and it's really funny actually.
It is kind of amazing, like the
Um,
props, the role that props play
uh,
in these situations.
Another thing I wanted to bring up is a lot of times when you're signing like your hiring stuff, like some of the rules, when I was in corporate restaurants, there would always be a line that would say something along the lines of like a smile is a part of your uniform.
Yeesh.
It's
Yeah,
cheesy, but that's usually they're like, you have to be happy and pretend.
so cringy.
Yes.
um, I like Goffman's point about this about the function of the backstage too, and maybe you can corroborate whether this is true or not. But like he's like, you know, because of all the fronting that people have to do, they really also need a backstage. Like they got to go like to the break room and complain about the customers, behind their back or whatever to the, like you're complaining among, your coworkers or whatever, or like the teachers who would go to the teachers lounge to, complain about students in a way that they can't do when they're in the front stage. The people need basically a backstage where they can kind of like let off steam and then like, express their frustrations, and that's kind of like how they kind of recharge their batteries to go out and go back onto the front stage. They have to like kind of let it out or whatever, and that this is like the function of the backstage. um so I don't know, maybe that makes sense. Kai, I'm sorry, I think I talked over you, but you had your hand up.
Oh no, I was just gonna I mean you explained it really well, but I was gonna say maybe that's why people like maybe need vices, like a way to like escape, like
Yeah.
because it's kind of exhausting to always like put on a front all the time, So like maybe that's why, and as sad as it is, people lean into things that maybe they, shouldn't lean into or, depend on because like, I don't know, like always having to like emotionally perform. And I think we all do it, even if you don't work in the service industry, I think we all have to do it, like we have to kind of turn it on, and I feel like it's just inescapable. So I don't know. I was just, yeah, commenting like maybe that's why people just have like vices and stuff like that.
Yeah, because it is exhausting to do that kind of work. It's different from like the physical exhaustion that you might feel working in a a coal mine or a assembly line or something like that. But it is like existentially kind of exhausting to be like to have to be on all the time. I have definitely felt that. Last semester I was teaching at UC Davis, and I would teach this class with 100 some odd students in it, and you really have to be like, on, in terms of like performing. And the class was only like, I don't know, an hour and a half, but like I would come out of that class just feeling so exhausted, just so, because you build up like a certain amount of anxiety beforehand. You want to make sure that like your performance is, that there are all these people looking at you. It's really like it can be really nerve wracking. And there's I think a lot of people who've kind of experienced that kind of like I don't know, stage fright or that sort of anxiety. And yeah, that might have something to do with the fact that there are so many people, using, like self-medicating in all kinds of different ways to compensate or to relieve themselves of the anxiety that they experience in those settings. I think that's a really good point, Kai. Okay, well, hey, those of you who are watching the archive too, if you want to weigh in here about, particularly about your, um, I think this is, we're having a really good conversation about like job experiences here with like service work. If you want to comment on that, but there are other things, we've talked about like with social media or online dating or other ways in which like performance and like fronting, creating a front stage impression is like even more important in our time than in like maybe in Goffman's time. And so in some sense he was really ahead of it. And so if you're watching the archive, this would be a good place to kind of chime in. I'm going to go to the reading and pull that up so that I can um, attend to you to some, sort of key parts of the text. Just give me 1 second to do that. Sorry about that. I lost my. Oh,
Sorry, y'all. I closed this out when I stopped the video, and I shouldn't have done that. It's just a mistake. Okay. I forget how long it takes to actually get from Canvas to perusal. Come on. Okay. There we go. All right. You will notice that this text is divided into a number of subsections that are kind of like interrelated with one another. I like this first opening quote about masks. It kind of like goes to, um, I think Goffman's sociology, it kind of seems simple and straightforward and commonsensical in some ways. This idea, like, society is like a theater and a performance. But it also raises like this kind of existential questions about the just sort of the nature of the human self. And this thing with masks is like, the kind of question or the conclusion that it draws, and I think the question that we need to ask in light of those conclusions is, are we as people, are we just kind of like the roles that we play? Are we the sort of the masks that we wear? Um, in Western philosophy, there's always this kind of idea that there's an inner self, like a soul, that there is an authentic inner self that is, kind of like different from the roles that we perform, the masks that we wear. And I think in some ways Goffman is trying to kind of get past that and say, like, maybe it is that we are just like the performances that, the roles we perform and the masks that we wear. Maybe that just like defines like just who we are. And maybe, he wants us maybe to kind of rethink this idea that there's some separate inner self, like an authentic soul, that is like in the backstage. Um, I don't have an answer for that. It's a kind of an existential philosophical question about the nature of being. But I think it's fun. It's interesting to ponder. Like, what's the difference between our outer self and some sort of inner self, and do we just become the person that people like expect us to be in a certain kind of situation? Like if you're I've seen it plenty of times where people are a police officer, or people are a teacher, or people are, um, uh, a priest or something like that. And the role that they play like changes them and shapes them. And so it might start off as like kind of a performance, but it comes to sort of define who they are individually. And so the first part of the text raises this question about the to what extent people believe in the part that they are playing. And Goffman basically presents us with like a spectrum. And he starts off by kind of defining the extremes of that spectrum. At one extreme are the people that basically become the thing that they are playing. They become that role, and they come to seriously kind of believe in it, to the extent almost that there is no difference between their inner self and their outer self, right? The front stage and the backstage are kind of aligned in this sort of way, where they have basically convinced themselves, as he says, about the show that they're putting on. At the other end of the spectrum, the other extreme, are the people who perform these roles very cynically, where they know they're just kind of performing a role and they don't believe in what they're doing at all. And it's all just for show. And it's all just like a performance. It might be for, kind of like self interest. They might be like a used car salesman who doesn't really believe in the cars that they're selling or what they're telling their customers. Or it might be a politician who's just like, oh, I'll just tell people whatever it is that they want to hear so that I get elected and I'm able to maintain office. Those are the real extremes of cynicism. Or, and it might be like, as he says here, a cynical individual may delude his audience for what he considers to be their own good or for the good of the community. So, like, if I am, playing Santa Claus at, a thing at the shopping mall, I'm not gonna, like tell. I want to keep up the facade of being Santa Claus, not because like I really believe I'm Santa Claus, but I'm doing it for the benefit of the kids and the community. And it would be actually like really detrimental to, to stand up and say to these kids, the truth, or, like to say like, oh, there is no Santa Claus and I'm just performing and playing a role. So there's all kinds of reasons in which people might maintain a really extreme discrepancy between their front self and their back self. And basically, he says like, oh, well, these are really actually kind of the extremes, and most people are kind of like somewhere in between. Some people, most people don't really like fully buy into the role that they're playing. They have some distinction between the role they perform and who they really are. And, there's like some kind of healthy discrepancy. But at the same time, they don't, completely like think that what they're doing is just like totally full of shit. Most people, probably except in maybe like more extreme versions of like pathological individuals or people who are compulsive liars or something like that. They might be able to get away with a huge discrepancy between their front stage and their backstage. But most people have to find some kind of like resolution. They have to justify and legitimate what they do, and to some extent that means in kind of believing in the role that they play. Here is where he discusses this distinction between the front stage and the backstage. And again, like, that as we've talked about with regard to like service work, this distinction between the two is really important. People need a sort of a backstage in order to relieve themselves of the pressures of the front stage. Dramatic realization is real interesting. Here is where like um, people kind of like show off the various ways in which people are kind of like dramatically showing off their kind of like performance. I always think of this like for those of you who like work in like the service industry or especially in restaurants. I always like when there's a waiter that's like pouring a bottle of wine and they make this big show about how the wine is not supposed to touch the glass and they like do this turn of the wine to the side and this kind of rotation. There's this whole and even the part of like pouring a little bit of wine and then having the person the customer like take a little sip of it and then they go, "Oh, that's good." Like, has anyone ever been like, "No, take it back. No, thank you. This sucks. I want a different bottle." I don't know. Jill, go ahead. I know you have some
Yes,
experience in these matters.
yes, they have done that.
They
I
have? They
worked
do?
at, I worked at a the place that I worked at the longest was a like a casual fine dining steakhouse. And so there was a whole ritual with how you're supposed to pour wine. You're not supposed to put the wine bottle on the table. When you
Mhm.
open it, you're supposed to let the person who ordered it um, try it before they purchase the bottle or whatever. Before you like pour the rest, you're supposed to pour it from the oldest male to the youngest male to the oldest woman to the youngest woman.
Oh, shit.
Right.
I didn't know about that part.
There's a whole ritual. There's a whole ritual with it. I don't know where it comes from. I'm sure it just has to do with like old school, I don't know, patriarchal wine tasting something.
Mhm.
Because there's a lot of like rules that you're supposed to follow. Some people
Yeah.
would be like, I don't care to taste it, just pour it, we're fine. But I have had people say like, no, this doesn't taste good. We want to do something else.
Huh. Curious.
Yeah.
I'm I'm glad to know that that does happen because I'm always like, like that this seems all very performative to me.
The whole thing is a performance and a ritual, and it's strange. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm good with boxed wine, so the whole like buy a fancy bottle of wine and then be like, no, send it back. I'm like, whatever.
Yeah, and how you could tell based on like a single sip and like the whole kind of like wine industry, really I feel like exemplifies a lot of these things that we're talking about. I often wonder like, do people really know what they're talking about when they talk about wine, or like you go to like a wine tasting and there's these really elaborate descriptions of the types of grapes and like where they were grown and what part of the world and blah blah blah. Like, it's not my thing. So like maybe I'm maybe somebody who is more knowledgeable would be more kind of impressed by it. But I'm just like, oh, like that's fine. I don't need the whole description. I just want to taste it. And so anyway, like that's one example I was thinking of. If you're again like watching it in the online archives, I'd love to hear your people's other examples that you can think of. That's just one that kind of comes off the top of my head. Um, so yeah, like he does talk about to some degree, like kind of people who are in the service sector or doing service work. So here he's talking about like undertakers, and like a funeral home, or merchants who charge really high prices. All these ways in which like there's this kind of performative ritual in which we kind of like go to extreme lengths in some cases to kind of convince our audience and to show them that we're working we're doing our job, we're taking care of them in ways that otherwise might be kind of invisible. And so you have to kind of like bring it to the front so that the customer knows, because there's I'm sure, all kinds of other stuff you're doing that like is invisible to the customer, right? And so in some ways, like this is the sort of like the opposite of that. Um, I think that these are interesting insights that Goffman has. So I encourage you to kind of like continue to think about examples like this. I've posed them both in the perusal reading assignments and for you to comment here if you're watching the archive video lecture. So for next time, what we'll do is we'll begin to look at Herbert Bloomer's writings on symbolic interactionism, and we'll kind of like begin to kind of extrapolate from Goffman's insights here into a larger theory of symbolic interactionism using drawing on the reading from Bloomer. In the meantime, I wish you a happy rest of your week. I hope you're all doing okay. And I look forward to seeing you on Monday. Have a great day and great rest of your week, everyone. Thank you. Go ahead, Cindy. Cindy, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, did you want to say? Oh, you're just saying
Yeah.
signing off. I see.
Have a good day. See you next week.
Okay, see you next week.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye bye.